Well, good morning to those of you joining us in the United States, and good afternoon to those of you joining us in Germany and in Europe. I'm Rob Fenstermacher, and I'm the Chief Content Officer at the American Council on Germany. And as many of you are normally aware, my colleague and president of the ACG, Steve Sokol, is usually moderating our events, but today he's actually taking a day off, which I think is very deserved given how many of these he does throughout the year. So I'm really pleased to be moderating today's discussion on media reporting of Russia's war in Ukraine. Since the Russian invasion of Ukraine on February 24th, the war has dominated the news in Europe, Germany, and here in the United States. And the images and stories coming out of Ukraine have been terrible and incredibly saddening. The conflict in Ukraine is not just being fought militarily, but it's also very much an information war as Ukraine and Russia attempt to control the narrative about what is happening on the ground in Ukraine. And the war, also in the months leading up to it, has led to a range of policy debates about NATO, German and US leadership, as well as the world order that many of us on this call have lived in over the past 20 to 30 years following the fall of the Berlin Wall. Today, we want to discuss what news organizations have been focusing on in their coverage of the conflict and how they acquire their information and ensure the accuracy of the information that they are presenting, amongst a number of other issues. So for our conversation today, we're really fortunate to have two European-based journalists with us to discuss these issues and more. In Berlin, I'm pleased to welcome Christina Brause, who's the deputy head of the investigative team at WELT and WELT am Sonntag, where she has worked since 2016. Much of her reporting has focused on influence and fake news in social media, so this is something we'll definitely address today. Grüße, Christina, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
And from Brussels, I'm pleased to welcome Cristina Gonzalez, an American journalist who is Politico Europe's executive producer for audio, a role in which she produces Politico's podcasts, including EU Confidential, which is a weekly podcast and newsletter featuring excellent analysis on the forces shaping Europe. And if you haven't listened to any of the episodes yet, I can highly recommend it. Cristina, it's really great to see you, and thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me, Rob.
Each of their bios has been posted in the chat, so you can get some more details on their background. Before I dive into the discussion, I'd also just like to remind our viewers that if you have questions, you can post them in the Q&A or in the chat function, and I'll strive to weave them into the conversation as we go along today. So I'd like to begin by asking each of you to give us a sense of how the media has been covering the war in Ukraine. What are the stories and the themes that news organizations have been devoting the most attention to? Is it about what's happening daily on the ground in Ukraine? Is it the exodus of refugees out of Ukraine into the neighboring countries? Or is it talking about the debates, the policy debates, and the role of NATO and sort of the response that the West has had related to this? So maybe Christina Brause, and we're really fortunate we have two Christinas that cause a little confusion. So I'm going to use your full names every time to be sure we know who I'm talking to. Christina Brause, perhaps we could start with you to hear a little bit about the German media coverage of the conflict.
I think there is a gap, or kind of a gap or transition between the time actually before the war, like the week before, and then afterwards. Like the week before, it was a lot about disinformation and Russian propaganda and how Putin is kind of talking about Ukraine, and that we saw some kind of preparation for what came next. And afterwards, like I would say the first week after the war started, it was a lot about what is actually happening inside Ukraine right now. Where is the Russian military? What are they doing? And I would say mid last week, we covered a lot of stories about the refugees in Germany. So first, of course, the refugees from Ukraine that came into Poland, and now they are arriving in Berlin most of the times because the trains are coming over here. And like what is Germany doing right now? And we see the first debates of, are we better prepared than in 2015? So I would say this is kind of what I saw, what media coverage in Germany was like.
So it sounds like it's covering all of those issues at this point. Would you say, though, that the focus now, and it sounds a little bit like that, is now on the ground and what's coming?
Yeah, so especially in my department, we have a colleague of us who is in Ukraine right now. We also have other colleagues from the foreign department in our media outlet, and from Bild, which is also part of Axel Springer company, who are in Ukraine. So we have a lot of coverage from people that are really on the ground in Kiev and so on, and also on the border of to Poland, to Romania. But also we have a lot of reporters in Berlin or in other cities in Germany, and they are speaking to the refugees which arrive now here. We also we talk with them about what they experience over here, what they experience during their, let's say, travel from Ukraine to Germany, but also if they are still in contact with family members or friends that are still in Ukraine.
Thank you. And that's a topic I actually want to come back to, is sort of the sources of information. But before, maybe I'll turn over to Cristina Gonzalez. And is it similar what you're seeing at kind of maybe at the European level, because you're not just focused on Germany, obviously, and are based in Brussels?
Right. Yeah, I would say that the story arc is very similar to what Christina had just described. I mean, for us, as covering specifically the EU level of things, there was so much focus in the weeks leading up to the actual invasion, where we were covering the diplomatic efforts to de-escalate tensions quite intensely, with every meeting that Macron would do, or Olaf Scholz, or anybody heading to the Kremlin to sit at a very large table. That was very heavily featured in our coverage. But I would say that we were also on high alert for any sort of false flag attempts to sort of already instigate and start a war at any moment. And for us, really having a sort of protocol in place for what it meant that an invasion had actually started. And I would say in the day that occurred, our focus immediately, like every news organization, I would assume, is to the immediate sort of what is happening on the ground. And it's those very basic questions that are often difficult for news organizations that might not have the full span of resources that are there to cover it in person. We were fortunate is not the right word, but we did have a few of our reporters who were on the ground in Ukraine at the time. They've all since left, but they were able to give us a semblance, a different view of coverage firsthand, whereas now the coverage that we do is more reliant on other independent news outlets, while now shifting more towards the sort of, again, diplomatic and political efforts that are being done, whether it's taking on sanctions, providing military equipment, and of course the refugee outpouring as well that Christina just described is also a story now that is being told in so many different levels and ways. And for us, also focusing on the policy response to that here in Brussels is an important aspect of this story, while at the same time, I would say not losing the human aspect of the tragedy that is unfolding. And so it's really sort of having all of those different layers of coverage that make it quite intense, but also I think quite important to provide all sorts of different frames and contexts to what is really happening.
Maybe a follow-up, Christina. Obviously, as a producer, you're on the side of trying to decide which stories to, in fact, cover. Could you provide maybe a little insight how that process takes place? I mean, you just identified a number of different issues and the importance of providing the different layers and the different perspectives. But what is it like in a meeting where you're trying to determine, what issue is it critical for Politico to be reporting on?
Yeah, it's a great question, right? Like, what priorities do you set of the stories that you tell? So in this case, as you mentioned at the top, which I very much appreciate, I produce our EU Confidential podcast, which is a weekly podcast that comes out on Thursdays. And the reason why that is important, of course, is because Putin's invasion happened on a Thursday. And so I can just share some information here that essentially we had built a whole episode. For example, in that week, we had a conversation earlier in the week with the Prime Minister of Latvia, and everything was set. And then morning comes and you realize immediately it's a whole different world. The whole world has changed, and every conversation that you had before Thursday is no longer in some ways not relevant, but the context has shifted so much that it wouldn't behoove you to use that information. And so we completely scrapped the entire episode, and in fact chose, in our case, to go live and do a Twitter space conversation with our reporters to just get an initial sort of reaction from all different views that we had around Europe, and turned that into our initial episode. But I remember at the time, to your question, already saying to my editor and thinking about how we're going to move forward, that there was going to be a huge refugee story to be told, but also keeping in mind that maybe now isn't the moment to tell that story, but that recognizing all of the different iterations that would be coming towards us and just finding the right timing to tell those sorts of stories. It's not easy, and it shifts so quickly. No. So for example, the episode that will come out later today is entirely different than what we had thought it would be on Monday. So I'm sure that every news organization, including Cristina, is dealing with this sort of fast pace of things, while at the same time trying to make sure that what you're putting out is accurate and relevant and put into context as possible.
Yeah, I can imagine. I mean, the events just constantly are changing from day to day, if not hour to hour, in terms of trying to get news out there. Again, a similar follow-up question maybe to Christina Brause on this topic is, what are there topics or issues that you feel are not in fact yet being reported on or are being underreported on related to the conflict that should be getting more attention that aren't so far, right? We heard about the policy debates, we heard about refugee and the actual conflict itself, but are there other aspects or issues that you feel like haven't been covered yet or need greater attention?
Well, there is one topic I would say that is kind of covered, but not in a full spectrum of all what you could say about it. It's the foreign people who are now going into Ukraine to fight over there, because somehow what I see is portraits of people like asking, why do you do that? You are a soldier from, I don't know, Germany or from the UK. Why are you going into Ukraine and to fight over there? And what I see when I read or watch, whether it's on TV, on a newspaper, when you see all those portraits, it's kind of heroic. So we see them as heroes now joining Ukraine forces. But what we also see, and we covered that in our team, some colleagues of mine covered that, is people belonging to the extremist spectrum going over there. And I mean, what we also know is that they are the Ukraine army is handing out guns to people who want to volunteer over there. Nobody actually knows what's really happening with those guns. Nobody knows what kind of stuff all the extremists are doing over there, because I don't want to say that all people who are joining the forces in Ukraine are bad people. I don't want to say that at all. There are heroes and there are people I really, they're really like brave, but nevertheless, we have to put a very close look on what they are actually doing over there. And I think that will take some time to figure it out, how to do it. And it's more like a story that is probably being told like in 6 months or 12 months or even later, because first time we saw extremists joining some kind of extreme forces also in Ukraine was after 2014. And so we saw that they are using the Ukraine and the Crimea crisis as kind of a battleground to gain experience, actually.
That's frankly a story I had not even thought of and I think that is certainly, as you said, I think something that'll play out over time. I'm going to come back to that a little bit about sort of coverage of the longer term impact of this and how the media is going to cover that influence. I'd like to turn, though, a little bit to a different topic. As I noted in the introduction, the war in Ukraine is really not just being fought militarily, but is also very much an information war, as Ukraine and Russia are trying to control the narrative to build support for their respective positions. We've seen President Zelensky regularly doing videos and meetings with parliamentarians in different countries to ask for support, to highlight the success of the Ukrainians in holding off the Russian invasion longer than I think many people had expected, and to illuminate the cruelty of the Russian military in killing innocent civilians in a lot of the areas of Ukraine. And President Putin, on the other hand, presents a completely different picture, calling the conflict a special military operation, presenting opposite descriptions of events like the attack yesterday of the maternity hospital. Again, just completely different viewpoint and perspective, and clamping down on any free press and social media in Russia that might provide a realistic picture of what is actually happening on the ground in Ukraine. And this raises a whole set of questions, and I'd first like to ask you both about the sources of information that news organizations are using in this conflict. How much are you, your organizations and others that you hear from colleagues, relying on official sources for the information that you're reporting and that are maybe coming from governments? Do German and European media outlets have a lot of people on the ground? Cristina, you mentioned you had both of you mentioned that at one point there were colleagues on the ground that are able to kind of give firsthand presentations. But then there's the whole other side of things of firsthand accounts being reported on by individuals on social media, on Twitter, on Telegram. Just this morning, I saw a news report that was about a Ukrainian woman who was basically doing a diary of her experiences since February 24th and had gained tens of thousands of followers who were hearing about her story. So I'm curious again to hear from both of you, what are the sources of information you're using for your reporting? And Cristina Gonzalez, maybe we can.
Yeah, I mean, I think before approaching the question directly, I would provide a sort of more general observation, which is that I feel as though we're in a completely sort of new era when it comes to information and also our awareness of fake news in the context of social media or otherwise. I do think that we've learned so much in the wake of since 2016, essentially being such a turning point with the US election of Donald Trump and Russia's influence there, whether it be Brexit, and quite frankly, the last 2 years of the pandemic, which has provided a lot of opportunities, dare I say the word, for fact checkers and news organizations to really beef up their game in terms of fact checking information regarding the coronavirus, but then also building up networks to be able to work together and combat that information more quickly. And so to that end, in speaking with some of my colleagues who cover disinformation on a regular basis, them saying that in some ways, people, journalists in particular, are more prepared than ever before for this sort of information battle that we're seeing play out. At the same time, that doesn't make it easy. And to your question, Rob, about, are you relying on official sources or citizen journalists or otherwise? I think the challenge here has been that to a certain extent, we've seen official sources not necessarily giving information that is accurate or credible as much as we might want that to be. For example, I think of President Zelensky and the many ways in which, as Cristina says, he's being held up as this, war hero and a fighter for freedom. But at the same time, we've seen him give information that wasn't accurate. For example, in this incident that happened on Snake Island, I don't know if people are familiar with this, of course, and saying that the soldiers, Ukrainian border guards that were there, were killed when in fact it turns out that they were not. And so That's just one example where you could chalk it up to a number of different things, whether it's deliberate disinformation or misinformation, or whether it's just very hard to verify information in a wartime situation. But either way, it makes it very difficult to parse through. And while we have a lot of tools, more so than now than ever before, to verify footage, in particular audio, video, and pictures, it still, takes time and effort. And sometimes for news organizations, those things are not necessarily a luxury.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of my feelings, my recollection is of the Gulf War, both Gulf Wars, and sort of how we didn't have social media for most of those early on. And so much of it really was those Pentagon briefings and other very official reports that came out that were telling us what was happening on the ground. And obviously, I think in many ways we may have been deceived by lots of things at that time. And it is, Christina, very different today in terms of the multiple sources and the individual sources of people on the ground.
Right. I mean, just picking up to that point very quickly, one thing that my colleague, Mark Scott, who I mentioned, who covers this for us, our chief technology correspondent, was saying that a sort of difference he's noticed is that the Biden administration, for example, in the US, is much more forthcoming with information in this regard about disinformation and other things that make it a bit easier, again, isn't the right word, but have made it a sort of different, a different sort of experience to be able to work with information provided by this administration as opposed to the last.
And Christina Brause, are there other sources of information that these organizations are utilizing? One of our attendees or viewers mentioned open source intelligence as something that can be utilized to get information. So I'd be curious, are you using that? Are you aware of others using that? And also, maybe you could discuss, again, the accuracy of the information that we're getting in the fog of war. I mean, how is it that you're fact checking the information? Cristina Gonzalez mentioned you're better prepared to do that, but how are you actually going about that? What are the sources that you use to find out the numbers are correct or the story is accurate? Whether it's the Ukrainians, how many civilians have innocently been killed or Russians killed versus what we're hearing from the other side. How do you fact check information?
Well, we also always stick, first of all, and in all stories, it doesn't matter if it's our news team or if it's a politics reporter or if it's a member of my team, which is an investigative reporter, then we always stick to the two source principle. So it's always, you have to have two sources. And if you can't confirm, you better hold back. Maybe let other media rush in, better be kind of, serious, because it's a time where every word or every article you write can be part of what's happening. So that's also something that is kind of new. It's not new, but I never seen it in that way as we see it right now, that whenever you write something, it may be also used online, because people will share it on Telegram and they will use your information, they will use your articles. You better be careful with your sources, you better be careful what you write. What we try to do is to speak to a lot of people, different people, like official people that are working in ministries with refugees. We are using our reporters on the ground. For example, we had one reporter who was at the border between Ukraine and Poland. And they said that in the city where he was in Poland, that there have been hooligans who attacked refugees who fled from Ukraine, but were usually or originally from an African country. So we didn't know if that was a true story, whether those hooligans really attacked those people. So he found footage online of a small video clip, and he showed it to people over there and asked them, like, did you see that scene really happening over here? He asked police officers, he asked people from NGOs who are working over there. So it's kind of, we use video material we find online, we talk to people, different kind of people We try to get documents, of course, like official documents. And sometimes it's not easy to tell, especially when it comes to victim numbers. It's not easy to tell. So what you write, if you want to write something, you write like, okay, this is stated by this source, and then everybody can, make up on their own mind if they want to trust the source or not. What I would say regarding fact checking, so we don't have a special fact checking team in our media outlet. Every reporter in our outlet has to do some kind of fact checking regarding their articles and what they write about. So I would totally agree that we are prepared in the way that we know that people are lying online, that we can't trust people who claim that they have been refugees from Ukraine and that they are telling a story and we take it for credit. But at the same time, what I see, and this is especially true for OSINT, so open source intelligence, that also the way stories and kind of facts or fake facts are made up is getting better. For example, I saw just a week before the war started, I saw a tool online that is creating satellite images of cities that actually don't exist. Because we are so triggered to use satellite image, because we all know it from Bellingcat. They used to fact check stuff, and they used to prove stories and facts. So we are really used to, oh yeah, it's a satellite image, it's kind of credible. But now we know there are also tools who can fake those kind of material of images. So it's getting, we are kind of better prepared, but the fake news are also getting better. So it's kind of, a run for who's better.
Which is scary, because speaking just of the satellite images, just last night, I saw a story that was showing a particular city in Ukraine, and they were showing pre and post images, and what you just described shows how easy it would be to fake, if you will, a city maybe being bombed or destroyed more than it actually had been based on imaging. So I'd like to see. Yeah, please.
Oh, sorry, Rob. I wanted to pick up on that because I remember years ago that there was, this sort of tension between questioning whether or not the media, for example, should shine the light on fake news stories or not. And, I think that this has shifted somewhat, especially I would observe in this case, whereby people are much more willing to say, like, this is not news, this is fake, this has not been verified, this has. I've noticed even, for example, outlets like CNN doing full segments explaining, like, this is how we do geo-targeting, this is how we do reverse searches on images, and all these sorts of different techniques that they use, different language from news organizations that say, like, this has been independently verified by, X news organization. And while at the same time, journalists going to painstaking efforts and fact checkers to actually list fake stories that they see, and like with big, X's or whatever on them, pointing out like, this is not real. And I very much appreciate that, because it helps me to be able to parse through and know that this has gone through this process, and like, we're calling it out, the sort of naming and shaming aspect.
But what is important over there, because I think ProPublica published a story yesterday, where they claimed that pro-Russian people online are using footage where they claim this is fake news from Ukraine, and actually this kind of footage never was shared online. So it's kind of also a disinformation story using this fact-checking label to prove that, oh, this is fact-checked. So
I'm glad you brought that up. That was actually something I had noted as well, hearing the story, that there was a particular, I think it was a Twitter account that's dedicated to taking, true stories of Ukrainians that are coming out and spinning it in a completely different way. And Cristina, just staying on this topic a little bit longer, as I mentioned in the introduction, you've done a lot of work investigating influence and fake news on social media. And I guess it would be interesting for me, and I think for all of our listeners, to hear more, how can we all do a better job of distinguishing, in fact, what is that disinformation or misinformation? Do we have to just rely on what Cristina Gonzalez just said of the media outlets listing those and highlighting them clearly to us, or are there other things that we should be doing as individuals and clues that we can be seeing to identify what is real and what isn't?
I would say critical thinking is important. For example, I realized that when QAnon became a big topic in Europe, that a lot of also friends of mine repeated those stories. And up to a certain point, I asked them, like, are you conscious about that all the bad politicians you are citing are from the Democratic Party? Isn't that something you think is kind of suspicious, that it's always the Democratic Party who's the bad politicians in those stories, or that it's always powerful women who are like blamed in those QAnon stories? So it's kind of, you probably are not really able to recognize every kind of disinformation or misinformation, because it's very good made, actually. It's very hard. Even we as journalists sometimes spend hours on fact-checking stuff with a huge number of sources that we rely on to do that. And I also had like once a workshop at Bellingcat, and where they explained how they work, and it's an incredible work that they are doing. But if you see their research, it's a research that takes weeks or months. So for you as a normal reader to fact check something like that is very hard. I would say have multiple sources. So if you are able to speak, for example, multiple languages, try to read an American media outlet, and then one from UK, and then one from France or from Germany. Look for the sources, look for different sources, look for maybe conservative newspapers, but also more liberal or social newspapers, and see what they are writing. And then you at least get kind of a feeling if there's some basic story that is true. And what I sometimes also see is that people are only reading the headlines, which is kind of depressing when you're a journalist, because you write all of that article and people are just reading the headlines and then they get stuff wrong. And yeah, that's basically it. It's very, it's not a good answer actually, but it's complicated. It's very complicated. That's why fact checkers need so much time to debunk stuff.
I actually think it's an excellent answer, but the challenge, as you said, I think, is with events happening so quickly and people being busy and all that, it's hard to in fact do the critical thinking and the investigation and the analysis of so many sources. Again, given all the competing stories and news and things happening in our lives. That
maybe to add something, what I realized during the COVID crisis is that audio in the so-called dark media is something that is really on the rise. So people are getting some kind of audio message from friends, and in those messages you had something like, oh, the neighbor of my uncle told me that that the bank is closed right now because of COVID, because money is out. And you have no name in it, no city, nothing. And I think that maybe we will see some kind of that with the refugees, maybe not as extreme as in 2015, 2016, but there were a lot of claims from right-wing parties, also right-wing groups, that were telling lies about refugees, and we probably will see some kind of that as well. So yeah, some kind of audios, videos, texts claiming that refugees did whatsoever. I know that police and all of the official ministries and so on, they are also having a very close look on what is going on within the Russian and Ukraine communities within other countries. So because we also have to check if they are not kind of, try to blame people for stuff they actually never did.
So Cristina Gonzalez, staying on disinformation and turning a little bit to international. One of your colleagues today had an article in Politico about media coverage of the Ukraine conflict in Hungary, which I saw on your Twitter feed, in fact. And she wrote, "To read and watch state-linked news in Hungary these days is to catch a steady stream of Kremlin-friendly framings, arguments, and outright conspiracies about the war in Ukraine. This, while at the same time, Prime Minister Orbán has publicly joined with the Western allies in condemning Russia over its invasion, has supported massive EU sanctions, and has even supported having NATO troops deployed to Western Hungary." So, diametrically opposed viewpoints. And so given the control of the media in Hungary and in Russia, as we know, how can the publics in those countries, I mean, we were just talking about, in our countries, looking at multiple sources, but how can the publics in those countries actually get accurate information about what is happening? And is there more that Western media outlets can do to try and provide that information? You may have seen it, but there was a story in the New York Times, I think a few days ago, about Ukrainians who had relatives back in Russia, who when called home and told them what was happening to them, their relatives in Russia reacted in complete denial and disbelief and said that's not happening, which shows just how unbelievably influential and powerful this misinformation and disinformation is in those countries.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I'd say first and foremost, I think we should pause for a moment to equate what's happening in places like Hungary at the moment with what's happening in Russia. Given the new law that Russia has just put into place, essentially banning all forms of independent journalism altogether. And it's a bit hard to compare that to Hungary, where, yes, the state media is essentially controlled by the ruling Fidesz party, while at the same time, there are still independent outlets and means of operating on the margins as an independent journalist. Whether or not they make that easy or not is a different question, but it's still there to a degree. I think in Hungary, it is a really fascinating situation, which I think we also need to look through a bit the lens of the upcoming election that is happening in just a few weeks' time, as to why the Prime Minister Viktor Orbán is sort of trying to straddle these two completely diametric messages as a way to sort of, in some ways cater to a domestic audience as compared to cater to the EU level or even the international audience. And oftentimes those two are very disconnected. And so you can get away with that because it's oftentimes difficult to make that connection to a certain extent. In Russia, of course, completely different sort of story, but quite alarming to say the least, given that, in this moment that we're experiencing, now more so than ever, would it be necessary to have journalists on the ground to give us a truly independent, verifiable understanding of what is happening in this moment. And that's really not possible. Not to go back to the podcast, but actually this episode of EU Confidential that will come out in just a few hours tonight features one of our colleagues who has reported for us for a long time from Moscow, who actually just left as a result of this law. And she talks exactly to this point that you described, Rob, of, talking to friends and sources and people who are still in Moscow or in Russia, and just the complete and utter disconnect that they have with even linking anything that's happening to them at the moment, whether it's they can't go to McDonald's now, they can't go to a Starbucks, they can't, shop at IKEA or whatever, to the actions that are happening in Ukraine as a result of Putin's war. And that disconnect is very difficult because for years and years and years leading up to this, the sort of messaging has been in place to the point where Putin can take these sorts of actions, and it's been being spun in a way as Russia essentially being the peacekeeper. And that's taken a long and just a long effort, I would say. So what can independent media do, or media organizations in the West. I mean, to a certain degree, you just have to keep on doing, right? And continue to do as rigorous reporting as possible, not shying away from social media and using the power there. But I've even read, to a certain degree, media outlets, setting up like short range radio stations, for example, in the region that can broadcast inside Ukraine, inside Russia. Even the BBC issuing sort of guidelines, for example, as to how you can kind of circumvent certain things so that you can have tools, different browsers and things along these lines to be able to still access information. But the degree to which that can counter what is being, propagated by state media is really, really difficult, and you have to make an effort. And I wonder how many people will be making that effort.
Thank you. And Christina Brause, is there anything you would add to that?
I would just maybe add that Russia is a huge country, as we all know. So in the last years, when we had stories from other regions than Moscow, it was kind of worth highlighting because it's such a huge country. So you don't have, in the whole media landscape, I would say, you don't have a lot of coverage of the whole of Russia. So what we mostly know about, we know at least, is what's happening in Moscow, what's happening maybe in St. Petersburg, and like the west of Russia. Actually, we have no idea. I don't have any idea. I never read huge stories about what's happening like in the east of Russia. So this is something, this country it's maybe not like China, but it's already kind of a black box. And I think I would agree that it's getting more and more a real black box for all of us. But at this point, at least, we can say that messengers like Telegram and Signal help to at least stay in contact to get kind of information that's maybe easier than it was 10 years or 15 years ago.
Yeah, thankfully those outlets exist, but I think, as you said, this black box issue goes both ways, right? We're as a result of this, probably going to know less about much of Russia and how people are feeling, and they're going to know less about our perspectives and I think we would argue the reality of what is happening. I'd like to turn to another issue, which is, as a general principle, news organizations are supposed to provide objective coverage of events. Often means that they're trying to include differing viewpoints that give balance to the reporting and the events that they're discussing, so as not to appear biased in any way. In this kind of crisis, do news organizations struggle to provide that, quote, balanced coverage? And is it even possible to say that there are perspectives on this conflict that deserve equal presentation, given the facts of what we see are happening on the ground? Can you really give a balance? And is it appropriate to be giving, the viewpoint from a Russian side equal weight in any way in the coverage here in news outlets? And maybe Cristina Gonzalez, we can start with you.
Yeah, it's a toughie. Because in this case, it feels so much not about providing equal balance for two just different viewpoints, but it's actually equal balance between news that is factually verified and just pure propaganda. And I think that's now what is being grappled with, is that it's like a completely new sort of level of thinking about, how much airtime do I give to the voice of, Russian propaganda or propaganda coming out anywhere, quite frankly, as compared to independent news. I can just give you a sort of very concrete example in putting together our podcast episode last week. It was really sort of for me to think about how much of Putin's speech, right, that he gave, and the sort of declaration, how much of his voice and credence did we want to give to him actually in voice, as compared to President Zelensky or any other sort of voices. And so even when just thinking about, how much of that you're willing to put out is a struggle. But I think one thing that always sticks with me when it comes to this issue of balance of coverage is kind of going back to coverage of Brexit, for example, where there's been criticism, for example, leveled at the BBC, which went to sort of like painstaking efforts to air the sides, one leaver says this, and therefore we have to have a Remainer that says that. And now people reflecting on this coverage and what that had sort of led to meant that oftentimes a leaver might have been voicing one view, but it might not have been from a very credible source or verified source when it comes to evidence-based, but still they felt the need to match it. And so the sort of they didn't have a sort of equal weight, if you will, and yet they were given equal time in effort to fulfill this exact sort of new, core value of news organizations, which is, balanced coverage. So, I mean, I'm certainly not equating Brexit to an ongoing war, but I'm just saying that I do think that this issue in general, as much as we can try to adhere to it, also can lead to sometimes have negative consequences as a result. But I do think, as I said, in this case, it's entirely different because we're dealing with not only just evidence-based facts, but that compared to propaganda. Christina, I don't know if you're also dealing with this sort of issues as well, right? Like how much credence do you give while at the same time trying to reflect what is happening?
We talked about that, I think last week in our team also about how often do you have to mention that there's no ongoing genocide in Ukraine, or wasn't an ongoing genocide in Ukraine that Russia claims there has been. So how often do you repeat, first of all, the argument of Putin, why he went into Ukraine? And secondly, how often do you repeat it and say this is a lie? So, I mean, it's kind of crazy for me that we are emphasizing so much that Zelensky is Jewish. I mean, why are we doing that? It's for me, I think it's obvious why media is doing that, to show that this can't be a country of Nazis when the leader of the country is Jewish, but it's kind of giving credit to the argument because you repeat it all over again. You repeat those propaganda stuff again and again and again and again. And I talked to a member of my team who has from a certain part of his family also Russian sources, let's say it like that. And he said, like, the more often you repeat it, you more think about it, and then you kind of, you don't believe it, but it sticks in your mind. So this is also, balance doesn't mean that you have to give credit to every propaganda, and you really have to, like you said, distinguish between what is credible information and what is not, which does not mean that we don't have to be careful not falling maybe also for, I feel kind of ashamed to call it propaganda, but Ukraine propaganda, because of course, when they claim that, this city is not taken by Russia, it still is in Ukraine hand, you don't know, you actually don't know sometimes, and you really have to be careful because of course, a war is not only a war of guns, it's also a war of who claims to be on top.
Yeah, I would echo that completely in terms of the propaganda. As much as sympathy as the West might have for Ukraine and the suffering of its people and what it's going through, you still have to, as a journalist, be rigorous in taking care that that information is also fact-checked in a way that you would fact-check information coming out of Belarus or coming out of Russia. And that might be challenging given the sort of emotional weight of everything, but at the same time, quite important so that you're not tripped up and sort of sucked in. I'm curious, sorry, Rob, to hijack the questioning, but also because one thing that I've noticed, there's been this sort of question about Western media's use of the word war, which, as we know, Putin, this is kind of his MO, that in Russia, you cannot call what's happening right now a war. And that this in some ways is painting Western media as being impartial and not balanced in their efforts because they're choosing to call it a war. And I just like completely reject this premise, because to us, like as balanced as we could be in covering what is happening, you know, to call it what it is and the language that you use is quite important. And he knows that. That's why you can't use that word. I don't know if that's also an issue that you guys have been grappling with at all.
I was going to touch on that as well, because I think the word war, or even what Christina Brause was just saying about the Russian claims of genocide. This morning, I heard Zelensky refer to the attack on the maternity hospital as genocide. I think it was awful and cruel and horrible, but that also is not necessarily the definition of genocide. So when you're talking about not wanting to be too one-sided, or even the word, you know, using the word war, Putin's war, right, is what is a lot of referring to it. And yes, maybe it was led by him, but I think the wording is so critical in terms of, you know, how it's presented. So I'd be curious, again, Christina, you know, dealing with that same kind of issue.
I think the first, I don't know, maybe 1 or 2 days, I often read the word Russian invasion, the Russian invasion in Ukraine. And then during the weekend, I read the more and more the word war, but it took some time to feel like, okay, that this is war, and that's it. So, but I think we are much faster calling this time a war than we have been with Iraq, for example. We had a huge debate in Germany back then if you could call that a war, if it's a war, if it's not a war. And then finally, I think it was our Minister of Defense who said, yeah, that's war. And they're like, oh, yeah, it's war. So we don't have this discussion this time. Although I saw, like I said, the first days, the word invasion used more than war.
Or conflict, right? We hear
conflict,
crisis, conflict. You know,
conflict, crisis.
To minimize it on some level.
Yeah, and what I also would say is that sometimes it's not so easy to use the right word, because, for example, we often use, or I often read right now the word propaganda concerning everything that is Russian information. And you also have to be careful about that. I mean, there is a lot of propaganda, of course there is, as we saw. And we talked about that. But for example, there was a city, I don't remember the name right now, last weekend, where Russia, or on Thursday, they claimed that they have that they took the city. And Ukraine said, no, they did not. And 24 hours later, they confirmed, oh yeah, it's now in Russian hands. That doesn't mean that this has been Ukraine propaganda or Russian propaganda. It just means that sometimes it's fluid whether a city is taken or not. How can you define if a city is taken or not? I mean, an invasion, if you come with military troops into a territory of Ukraine, you can say, okay, this is an invasion. But on which point do you really claim that this city is taken or this area is taken by the Russians or not? So you really have to be careful when it's propaganda, when it's maybe different point of view or different definition. And it's the same like what you said with war crimes. It's hard to prove sometimes what's really happening. And so we have to be careful with our words and also to repeat whatever a party is saying in this war.
Thank you both. So we're coming in on the end of our 60 minutes together, and I had another question that I want to kind of come back to the coverage issue in terms of one question that was posed by one of our listeners about, was there enough coverage pre-war about the buildup of Russia, of what it was happening in Crimea, and did some of that get missed in advance of what was happening? And then I wanted to go more towards the longer term sort of issue of, right now we're focusing on the immediacy of the war and what's happening there, but how much coverage is going into Germany and Europe about the longer term impact that this crisis is going to have, whether it's, you know, the refugees who may be for months and years, you know, there's over 2 million in different societies. As we heard from Chancellor Scholz, I think it's totally changing. You know, he used the word Zeitenwende, that it's now a change of era and that we're all going to have to think about the geopolitics and the world very differently than we have for the last 2 or 3 decades. So how much, that first question, what was missed pre-war, and how much is the media covering kind of the longer term impact, or when do you think that will start happening, and should the media in fact be doing more on that? Cristina Gonzalez, maybe we'll start with you. Sure.
Well, I guess when we talk about pre-war, how far back are we going here, right? Because we could go back to 2014 already to a certain extent and question whether or not there was enough coverage at that point, understanding the ramifications of the annexation of Crimea. At that time, I was working in the US, and from my humble perspective in the US, I was a bit sort of outraged that there wasn't more outrage in the sort of recognition of the potential long-term impact that this could have. And then we sort of fast forward to this moment now. I mean, I would say, this was the primary focus of our coverage at Politico Europe, and since basically since Christmas, since the holidays, and even before that, when already we were seeing the buildup of Russian troops. And so from our perspective, I think we've done our due diligence in terms of coverage. I think what nobody could anticipate, quite frankly, was just the complete, not the big question mark, right? Which was the unknown factor of Putin's willingness to actually pull the trigger. Oh, that's a terrible thing to say in this moment. Putin's willingness to actually take action. And I don't think that many people would have believed, perhaps also in Germany, into the upper echelons of the elite, that he would go this far. And so that's just an unknown quantity that we just couldn't have known. I think to the sort of long-term question, it's a difficult one because we can't, and I don't think we want to or should lose sight of the sort of immediate things that are still happening on the ground in this very moment, and the human suffering that is happening in and around Ukraine, and then all that is, befalling those who have come to the European, to the EU and other countries who are seeking, safety in this moment. But there is, of course, a sort of forward-looking trajectory that people are now trying to parse out. And I think the difficult part from the EU perspective is that, as one of my colleagues put it, it's like the tectonic plates of European politics have completely shifted. And so your understanding of what would have been just a few weeks ago is now completely out of the water. And so it's almost like reporting in an entirely new landscape where you are trying to figure out what those long-term ramifications are. But the basis by which you're judging whether or not that's possible or not is a lot more difficult to do as a result of the huge changes in policies that we've seen happening, of course, in Germany, but also at the EU level.
Thank you, Cristina. And Christina Brause.
I would say when I think back at 2014-15, I saw a lot of coverage about the Crimea crisis, which it was called back then, and Putin's intention in the Crimea. And then it kind of went silent, not really silent. Sometimes you read an article, you had a documentary on TV, but it was not like the whole time. It was like, oh yeah, there's some kind of conflict in the East. And I would also say that since Christmas, we wrote and talked a lot in Germany about Ukraine and Russia. And what I still remember is one reporter on TV who was a German reporter in Kiev. And when the war started, so Russia invaded Ukraine, he said, or she said, like, yeah, like 1 week ago, when I asked people over here if they think that there will be some kind of war, they called me crazy. So I felt crazy asking that question, because when you ask people on the ground, like, do you think that's possible? And they say to you, like, no, this is like, normal stuff. You feel kind of, yeah, oh, maybe that's a journalistic thing to always talk about war and if Russia is going to do something or not. And then it yeah, it was actually the right gut feeling. But sometimes you feel too journalistic, too like, oh yeah, it's like journalists, they always want something to happen. So yeah. And the long term, I think we always look at the long term, at least in my team, because that's what we also do. And as I said, we already, after 2014, we covered how extremists are going into the east of Ukraine to train for war, maybe using that in some kind of civil war they fantasized about in Germany. We talked about the connections between right-wing extremists between Germany and the east of Europe. So I think this kind of coverage, we are already thinking about that this is possible because we know it's possible, because we know it happened. But it's so hard to say what will be the focus, if it's going to be the focus of the refugees in Germany, because we don't know how much of them are staying. And if they may face the same problems the refugees from 2015 had, because they had a lot of trouble with language, finding jobs. Maybe that's not the case for the refugees coming from Ukraine. Maybe it is. So there will be some kind of long coverage, but it's so hard to say which topic.
Well, thank you both. This has really been an incredible conversation, and we've managed unbelievably to cover, I think, a wide range of issues and topics. I think we actually could have probably talked for another hour, given the things that we talked about. But I think what we definitely learned today is how incredibly important and what work you're doing to provide us with accurate and objective information, and I think also provided us with information about the responsibility and work that we all have to do as individuals to ensure that we're getting accurate information and understanding, what is taking place. So I want to thank you both for taking time to present all these issues. I hope we can have you back at some time in the future. Hopefully not that we're still talking about the immediacy of this unbelievable tragedy and war, but maybe how we're trying to recover from this awful event. So I wish you all a wonderful rest of the afternoon, to everybody, and evening. Thank you again, and we'll see you again soon. Auf Wiedersehen.
Thank you so much. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.